Hello, Amber here and welcome to my knitting studio. Today I have an introduction to mosaic knitting tutorial to share with you. Mosaic knitting looks quite complex. It's such an effective technique, but it's so much easier than it looks. It's one of my favourite techniques. I love the varying textures that you can achieve with mosaic knitting and the geometric patterning. Essentially, mosaic knitting is stripes. You only ever work one colour per row and you knit 2 rows in that colour. So you'll knit a right side row and then back across the wrong side row. Then for the actual colour work part, it's achieved by slipping stitches. So for example, this pink row is knit back and forth. Then this colour work row with the black spots is worked with the black colour. So you don't carry the pink along with the black, you just knit across with the black and slip stitches along the way. Here you would knit black, slip the pink stitch, knit black, slip the pink stitch, and so on. Here you would knit 5 stitches across here and then continue knitting and slipping the pink. Here we've got pink where we knit most of the stitches across, but the black stitches in this row are slipped to produce a mosaic pattern. So once you get the hang of it, it's really easy. And then the return wrong side row, you would just knit back across, working with the colour that you worked on the right side row. So you'd either work back with the pink or the black. And on the way back, you'll be slipping the stitches that you slipped on the right side row and knitting the stitches that you knit on the wrong side row. Or I should say working the stitches on the wrong side row. Some wrong side rows will have you knit and some may have you purl. The slip stitches will always be slipped. In this quick little tutorial today, I'll share a swatch with you and a chart for the swatch, talk about how to read the chart, how to slip the stitches, how to work each right and wrong side row, and also some tips for fixing mistakes along the way. Mosaic knitting works best with really contrasting yarn. So here you can see I've got a light colour and then a fairly dark colour, which is a strong contrast. It's also really effective working with gradient yarns or fade yarns. For example, with this hat, it's a DK weight project and I decided to use a bunch of fingering weight scraps that I had and make a fade for the colour work part of the hat. I used black DK weight yarn for the main colour, and then for the contrast colour, I held 2 strands of the fingering weight yarn together. Another way to use coloured yarn in a project that's also effective is using a colour change yarn. I used some spin cycle yarn for this project, and I paired it with a solid contrasting dark colour. So you really need that strong contrast for the pattern to be the most effective, but it's up to you. You can do a softer contrast if you like, and that can be effective as well. For today's tutorial, I've created a little swatch project so you can knit along with me and try mosaic yourself, or just watch, and you'll probably understand enough to tackle your next mosaic project. I created a mosaic knitting worksheet for this tutorial, and you can download your own copy if you'd like to knit along by following the link in the comments below. Mosaic knitting patterns generally will come with written instructions and a chart. Sometimes it might be just written or just a chart. If you have a strong preference either way, it can be worth reading before purchasing a pattern to find out if it says anything like chart only, if you're someone that really prefers written instructions, and vice versa. I generally include both in my patterns. I do have at least one pattern I can think of where the mosaic charts are quite huge, and I decided to only include the charted instructions for that pattern. So generally there's abbreviations section that will explain any abbreviated words, the written instructions, and then the 2 mosaic charts that I'll be talking about today, and instructions for each of those charts because they slightly differ. I wanted to include both charts so I could show you a chart with right sides only and a chart with both right and wrong sides. If you follow either of these charts, you'll knit this same swatch. The reason this looks different is just the inclusion of the wrong side rows, which stretches out the pattern a little more. Generally, I would use a condensed chart. I think it shows it effectively. And if the wrong side rows are all the same, then it's not necessary to include those rows in the chart. You can just have an instruction just for the wrong side rows. However, in some mosaic patterns, there may be purl stitches, for example, on the wrong side, or even different shaping occurring for the edges, which is not the case in this swatch. And in that circumstance, you would need to see what the different wrong side stitches are if it's not the same instruction for every wrong side row. So I included this just to show you what that looks like. And the main difference is the numbering, the row numbers. In the right side only chart, you just have the right side rows numbered, and they're the odd numbered rows which correspond to these. Row 1, 3, 5. And with the wrong side included chart, you can see the wrong side rows up this side. The way that you work both charts is you work right side row, so this is the right side, this is the wrong side. You work the right side row from right to left, so you'll follow the stitches this way, and the same here. And then for the wrong side row, you turn your work and work back across from left to right, or you would just follow the instruction given for the wrong side row. You continue working back and forth, or in the case of this chart, just work across, work the wrong side row, then come back and work the next right side row. When I'm knitting from the chart, I like to have a little marker to help me keep my place, and I'll move it above the row that I'm knitting, work that row, and then move it up above the next row that I'll be knitting. Let's get started. The instructions say to cast on 19 stitches and knit one row. If you have eagle eyes, you might have noticed that I have started with a different colour at the bottom of my first swatch, and what I did there actually was just cast on and knit one row for rows 1 and 2, but I thought I should demonstrate properly for this tutorial. So cast on with colour 2, knit one row, and then we start with row 1 of the chart or the written instructions. Essentially, we'll be working a stripe. There are no slipped stitches in this row, so it's also just knit across. Okay, I've knit row 1. So cast on with colour 2, which is a dark colour, knit row 1 and then back across for row 2, and row 3 is the first mosaic knitting row. Now you don't need to break the yarn as you're knitting, you just carry it up the edge. I like to put the yarn used over the top and bring the yarn I'm about to use underneath. And with the mosaic charts, there is an instruction here for the right side rows. It says work the rows right to left, which we've talked about, using the colour indicated in the first square of the row, so you know that the first colour is a colour that you need to use. In the written instructions, it will say with colour 1 or with colour 2, so it's quite clear. The first stitches are knit and then slip, and there's 4 of those: knit, slip, and then knit 3 down here. So I knit the first stitch. To slip the first stitch, I insert the needle as if to purl, so purlwise, and slip that over, and that's it. Then I knit and slip. With the slip stitches, it's noted in the abbreviation as slip stitch purlwise with yarn in back, unless otherwise noted. We have the right side of our work and the wrong side of our work, that's clear. With yarn in front and yarn in back, it relates to how we're holding the work at the time. So here I am holding my work and I want the yarn to the back of my work. I knit the next stitch, slip with the yarn in back, knit the next stitch, slip. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll knit the next 3 stitches as per the chart. And slip and knit to the end of the row, which ends with a knit. So that's the end of row 3. If I were following this chart, then I'd knit back across according to the chart. However, we're just following these wrong side row instructions, which say, using the colour worked in the previous row, knit all stitches knit in the previous row, slip with yarn in front all previously slipped stitches to the end. So the first stitch is knit. Then I need to bring the yarn to the front of the work to slip that stitch so that the float sits behind on the wrong side of the work. Bring the yarn forward and knit. Bring the yarn to the front of the work to slip that stitch, then bring it forward to knit. If I had some purl stitches in here, then clearly I would keep the yarn here to purl, but this swatch is all garter stitch. If you don't bring the yarn forward and you slip and then knit a stitch, you'll end up with a little mistake there, a little error with that yarn sitting in front rather than having that nice slipped stitch line. So it's something it's something that takes a bit of concentration to get the hang of at first, but I'll show you some ways to make repairs if you need to while you're knitting. And that's it. Here we are at the end of row 4, and we have some slipped stitches, knit stitches, and starting to create our little flower motif. And I've just knit across row 11, and I want to talk a little bit about how to fix mistakes, which is really quite easy to do. So you might notice I have made a couple of mistakes here where I didn't slip that stitch or that stitch. Instead, I knit across it. The great thing about mosaic knitting is that it is really simple to drop down and correct any stitches. So if you're comfortable with laddering down your work and fixing up stitches, it's a really easy way to get back on track. So for example, I knit back across to where I didn't slip the stitch. And the same goes for repairing a stitch where you may have accidentally slipped with the yarn in front of the stitch on the right side. Oops, I've just knit past it again. Hang on. So I get to the point where that stitch should have been slipped, but I knit it instead. So what I'll do is drop the knit stitch off and just pull the slip stitch up. There will be a little bit of a loop, loose loop left behind the work, but that's fine. It'll block out, and it's easier than pulling out all of your work to repair a little mistake. So here's a slipped stitch, and then the slip stitch I missed. Again, I'll just drop that stitch out and slip the stitch that was supposed to be slipped on the needle. Little loose bit, but that's fine. Bring the yarn back, slip that stitch and knit back across. So that was only going down one row, but you can continue to drop down several rows if need be to repair a stitch that went awry down here. Some knitters like to use a crochet hook to pick up the stitches as they're working their way back up again. I usually just use my needles. It's if you're not familiar with doing that, it's certainly a skill that's worth practicing to get the hang of with your knitting so that you can ladder down and correct mistakes a few rows down easily. And I made another error here so I could demonstrate another way to correct mistakes in mosaic knitting, and that's by using a duplicate stitch. So you might not notice an error until you're blocking your project, it's off the needles, and it's not too late. There's still a way that you can fix it. So by duplicate stitch, I'll use my tapestry needle and some of the yarn that I need to use. So here it's missing the slip stitch, the pink slipped stitch, and instead I had knit across with a dark colour. So I'm just going to mimic a slip stitch with a duplicate stitch. I'll start that by coming from behind the work, and for a slip stitch, duplicate stitch, I create a little loop, come back in under, being sure not to go down the same spot as I came up so that it will hold on to the work, and then bring the needle up and through the top of that loop, and there I'm creating what looks like a slip stitch, and bring it down over the top of the loop. And then I'm just going to come back under and do another little stitch over to mimic that. So there's the loose strands on the other side. I'll just weave those into my work as I'm weaving in all the ends. And voila, you can hardly tell. I use this technique quite a lot, and it's really effective and a great way to repair any of those mistakes that you missed. Thanks for watching. I hope this gives you the confidence to try mosaic knitting for the first time. Remember to check in the comments below to download your Introduction to Mosaic Knitting worksheet and swatch along with me, or just get started on your first mosaic knitting project. It really is so much easier than it looks.